Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, Rural Manufacturing Resilience, Factors Associated with Plant Survival. My name is Nancy McNiff, and I will be your host. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted at a later date on the ERS website. At any time during the webinar, you may enter a question into the chat feature at the bottom left corner of your screen, and the speaker will answer your questions at the end of the presentation. Our speaker today is Sarah Lowe. Sarah is an economist with the Rural Economy Branch at the Economic Research Service, U.S. Department of Agriculture. Sarah has a PhD in Agricultural and Consumer Economics from the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. Her research interests include rural economic development, entrepreneurship, labor, land use, amenities, and spatial analysis. Welcome, Sarah. I think we're ready to start, so you can begin your presentation now.
Thank you, Nancy. Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining me. As Nancy mentioned, this webinar is based upon a recently released ERS report, and I'm also required to say that this research was conducted with restricted access to BLS data, and the views expressed here do not necessarily reflect the views of BLS. Okay, let's get started, everyone. Just to kind of give you an idea where we're headed today, I'm going to start with a brief overview of the study and the results. Then I'll explain the data and the statistical model used in the analysis before discussing the results and concluding. All right, this research project asked the question, what factors were related to rural manufacturing plant survival 1996 to 2011? I examined the survival of manufacturing plants who participated in an in-depth ERS survey in 1996. I then linked the survey respondents to data at BLS to try and explain survival 15 years after the survey. Here I'm defining survival as having at least one paid employee. And although survival is only one indicator of manufacturing plant success, it's something that we can assess easily with administrative data and for a large number of plants. All right. Throughout this presentation, I will refer to non-metropolitan counties as rural counties and metropolitan counties as urban counties. To preview the results, I find that rural plants were more likely to survive than plants in urban counties. So again, plants in non-metro areas were more likely to survive than plants in metro areas. And among rural plants, all else being equal, independent plants were more likely to survive than multi-unit plants. And smaller independent plants were more likely to survive than larger independent plants. All right, just to provide a little context for this study. The study period 1996 to 2011 was one of general manufacturing employment decline. As you can see in this chart, rural manufacturing jobs declined over from the beginning of the study period until just after the end of the last recession. The good news for rural manufacturing employment is that it has been relatively steady in the years since the Great Recession. And despite a declining share of employment during the study period, manufacturing provided almost twice as many jobs and 3 times the earnings of production agriculture in 2011, despite record high ag prices and earnings that year. So that kind of just puts into perspective the size of the manufacturing sector in rural areas. Another analogy that might be helpful to you, rural manufacturing employment is approximately equal to rural retail trade employment. So that gives you an idea. If you think about all the people working in retail, that's similar to the number of people working in manufacturing in rural America. Okay, this project used some pretty unique data. As I mentioned, the 1996 ERS Rural Manufacturing Survey was linked to the quarterly census of employment and wages based upon establishment name and address. Linking the in-depth survey to the employment census allows us to follow survey respondents over time. The bad part is we only have the in-depth information for 1996, but the good part is we can follow these plants over time every quarter, so that's kind of nice. The matching rate for the linking was exceptionally high for this sort of activity, especially using data from the mid-90s when a lot of the addresses were P.O. boxes or rural routes, for example. So we had an 88% match rate. 6 states were excluded from the analysis, but despite some of them being manufacturing heavy states, the final sample is still pretty representative of U.S. manufacturing in 1996. All right, let me just start with some summary statistics. Just over half the plants survived the duration of the 15-year survey period, study period. So 55% of all plants overall survived. Rural plants were more likely to survive at 57%, and urban plants had a 52% survival rate. Rural independent plants had a 62% survival rate, while rural multi-unit plants such as a branch plant had a survival rate of 50%. The survival rate also varied a lot by industry. The rural textile and apparel industries had only a 26% survival rate. To help disentangle the effect of, say, industry and whether the ownership structure is single unit or multi-unit and how those two are related to survival, this report relies on a statistical analysis known as hazard analysis. The variable of interest is the time interval between the 1996 survey and a plant's exit, if that occurred. I use what is called a Cox proportional hazards model to relate the amount of time until plant failure with plant characteristics and county characteristics. I control for the statistical effect of certain factors related to survival rates, and these are the so-called explanatory variables. So on this slide I have listed all the explanatory variables. Quite a few of them are from the survey. I tried to use explanatory variables from the survey when possible. Others are from census data. And like I said, only the dependent variable, the survival, is from the BLS data. Okay, let's dive into the results. Before I dive in, I just want to point out that to ease interpretation, I've converted the results into a % increase in the probability of survival with a higher value for each variable of interest. So let's just start at the top here. When we pool all the plants together, we find that independent plants are 27% more likely to survive, conditional on all those explanatory variables that we talked about in the last slide, than multi-unit plants. So conditional on all those things, independent plants are 27% more likely to survive. Then I wanted to look at rural versus urban. So looking at the whole sample, again, we find plants in rural counties are 23% more likely to survive than plants located in metro counties. I also wanted to tease out the differences between metro and non-metro for the independent and multi-unit plants. So when only looking at the independent plants, so all the independent plants, I find that the ones in rural counties are 35% more likely to survive than the ones in metro counties. And I actually don't find any difference between rural and urban survival rates for multi-unit plants. So this suggests that the independent plants are really the ones driving this metro, non-metro, or rural-urban result. So that's kind of an interesting result. I think partly what's driving this is that the urban environment is more competitive, and also that independent rural plants may stay in business longer than optimal due to idiosyncratic reasons, such as they're a family business And there may be or fewer alternate investment opportunities as opposed to a similar business in an urban environment. So there's quite a few potential explanations for that. Some of them due to just the nature of doing business in rural areas. Okay, next slide. So now I'm going to focus my results only on the rural plants, as that's our purview here at ERS. And I'm also splitting the independent and multi-unit plants apart in the analysis, partly because the results are so different for the independent plants versus the multi-unit or branch plants. Okay, so looking at size, I find that smaller manufacturing plants are more likely to survive in rural areas than larger independent manufacturing plants, but there's no effect for the multi-unit plants. So more specifically, a rural independent plant with 100 employees is 9% more likely to survive than a rural independent plant with 200 employees. I also wanted to highlight the industry results. Again, I mentioned textile and apparel were particularly hard hit during this study period. And here we see that, for example, the apparel plants were almost 200% less likely to survive. So that's about 3 times less likely to survive than food manufacturing, which was my baseline. None of the other manufacturing industries had a significant difference in survival compared to food, but textile and apparel really did. So that was kind of an interesting finding. Again, these are not all the findings. There's more findings in the paper, but these are just the findings I wanted to highlight. Okay. My third and final results slide. So this is kind of before I dive into these results, this is kind of an interesting slide because a lot of manufacturing plant survival studies look at size and industry and ownership structure, the things I've already talked about, primarily because that's what we have data on. So one really unique thing about this study using the ERS Rural Manufacturing Survey is that we had some variables, some information that we've really never used in survival studies. For example, capital availability, like I'm going to talk about here. So with that, the caveat, of course, is that these findings are based on imperfect data. The survey only asked about perceptions. So is capital a major problem or a minor problem? So that's one downside to using the survey. And of course, the difficulty in accessing capital and the importance of various government programs are not assessed. The difficulty is assessed, not necessarily the participation. Also, we have to keep in mind these findings are not necessarily causal. Rather, they suggest further research may be warranted. And again, because we get the information from the survey in 1996, we don't know if a plant, say, got a government guaranteed loan right after the survey. We're only able to observe that information in the survey in 1996. Okay, so again, some selected results. We find that plants that indicated obtaining financial capital was a major problem were 29% more likely to fail than plants indicating it was a minor problem or not a problem, and that's for the rural independent plants. The effect was smaller for the rural multi-unit plants, 31% more likely to fail. Now again, like I just said, these aren't necessarily causal. Plants that are having trouble getting access to financial capital, maybe there's a reason they're having trouble getting access, and that's tied to their failure. We don't really know, but this is an interesting result that there was a high correlation between the perception that obtaining capital was a major problem and subsequent failure. The survey also asked whether government direct loans were important, and we didn't find any statistically significant effect on the government direct loans. Part of that is this is a relatively small group. 13% of the plants, I think, had this type of indicated they had this type of loan, and only about a third of those said it was important. So we're talking, about 5% of the sample here. So we don't have a lot of power on these tests. For the government guaranteed loans, if a rural independent plant indicated that government guaranteed loans were important to that plant, they are actually 74% more likely to fail, whereas for the multi-unit plants, they're 45% less likely to fail. This is a very interesting result, and on the surface seems counterintuitive. Why would one be more likely to fail and the other less likely to fail? And I think the reason for this is that the survey question lumped together a lot of different types of government loan guarantee programs. And the two different types of government loan guarantee programs are either for companies that can't get a regular loan, and so they get a government guaranteed loan and different underwriting standards. Whereas the USDA Business and Industry Guaranteed Loan Program, the manufacturing plant getting the loan actually has to meet all the regular underwriting standards. So they have to meet the credit score, all these different things that you would have to meet to get a regular loan even without the loan guarantee. So my hypothesis on this is that the multi-unit plants might be more likely to participate in the kind of program that the USDA Business and Industry Loan Guarantee Program is, and that the independent, single unit, rural plants might be more likely to participate in the programs that are helping plants that can't otherwise get access to financial capital. And kind of like in the first one here, obtaining capital being a major problem, it's more of a correlation. It's not that the government guaranteed loans are causing them to fail. It's more that they couldn't get access to traditional credit, which is maybe an indicator of other problems and correlated with them potentially failing. So that's a lot to discuss there. And there's more in the report, but I'm glad to answer questions on that. Just type them into the chat. Okay, just to summarize the findings one more time. All else being equal, the independent plants are 27% more likely to survive than plants part of a multi-unit firm. Plants in rural counties are 23% more likely to survive than those in urban counties. And when we focus on our rural independent plants, we find that the smaller plants were more likely to survive. The apparel and textile plants were least likely to survive compared to all the other industries, or with food manufacturing as a base. And plants reporting that obtaining capital was a major problem were more likely to fail. Okay, so to conclude, higher dependence on manufacturing jobs and income suggests that rural plant survival is integral to communities in which they are located. So a community that has a rural manufacturing plant, probably a lot of people and a lot of money coming into that community depend on that particular plant. Results offer potential insights into rural economic development policy. For example, results may suggest retention policies should be examined with the knowledge that multi-unit plant retention is more idiosyncratic than single-unit plant retention. If you take a look at the report, you'll see that the single-unit or independent plant survival was easier to predict, whereas the multi-unit plant survival was a little more idiosyncratic. And another point is that another conclusion from this results are that more research would be helpful. For example, especially on the financial capital questions. So access to financial capital may be related to rural manufacturing plant survival, but more research is necessary to really understand this relationship. But there were some interesting findings here, and some of us at ERS hope to be doing more research on this in the future. And with that, I will take questions. I have the link to the full report right here. And there's also a journal article that uses the same data but looks at a little bit different question. It kind of focuses on localization and competitiveness as they relate to plant survival. And that's written by myself and Jason Brown. It's available in Growth and Change. Nancy, do you have any questions for me? It looks like I'm looking at the chat and it looks like some of you guys had some audio problems, so hopefully everybody's able to listen at this point.
At the beginning of the presentation, a few people had some problems, so you may have to go back if the questions pertain to earlier slides. But let's start out with a question about the survey in 1996. Was the survey representative of all manufacturing plants or just rural plants?
Great question. Okay, so the survey was with weights nationally representative of all manufacturing plants with 10 or more employees. What was unique about this survey is that we did a rural oversample. So if we sampled just based on being nationally representative, we'd have a lot of plants in metro areas because that's where the majority of them are. So this particular survey had a rural oversample, and then we used survey weights to make it nationally representative. What the rural oversample does is it gives us a lot more observations and more detailed information about rural plants specifically. But it's really nice to be able to compare the rural and urban.
I have a question about, were there any significant differences geographically among the rural plants that you were looking at?
Yes. No, I didn't talk about it in today's webinar, but in the report there's actually a section on plants in the South. And so what I found is that during this particular time period, plants in the South, even controlling for industry, plants in the South were much more likely to fail than plants in other regions of the country. And I offer some hypotheses about why that might be in the report, but also the journal article talks about it a little bit more.
Okay. Can you clarify the difference between, or give an example of, an independent versus a multi-unit plant?
Yeah, good question. Maybe I should have better explained this during the webinar. So an independent plant is a plant that is part of a firm with only one location. So it's a standalone plant. It might be owned by an entrepreneur who lives in a rural area and he opened the plant in his hometown, and that's the only unit for that firm. In contrast, a multi-unit plant is a plant that's part of a firm with multiple locations. So you might think about a Maytag plant. They've got headquarters somewhere, and they've got one plant maybe making dishwasher engines, and one plant maybe assembling dishwashers, or that sort of thing. And so that's so we would call those multi-unit plants are either headquarters and then branch plants. And so a lot of economic development policy in the past has focused on kind of trying to recruit a branch plant. Like maybe we try and get a John Deere plant to come to our town. So that's kind of what I mean by a multi-unit plant. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, and there's sort of a follow-up question. What are some of the reasons independent plants seem to be more resilient?
So good question. So I think there's a couple different things going on here. One is that for the multi-unit plants, the decisions for survival or location are generally made at headquarters, and they're not made with that community in mind. So to go back to my Maytag dishwasher example, at the headquarters of Maytag, they're going to do whatever is best for Maytag regardless of what the impact on a certain town. Whereas the independent plants, I think they're more likely to be locally owned, and certainly the independent plants in rural areas are more, a little more likely to have ties to that community. So maybe it's a family business or a multi-generational business with ties to the community. And so maybe the plant wants to stay there. Maybe they want to operate through a down period even if they're losing a little bit of money on variable costs, because the fixed costs have been spent and they're committed to that community, or their family works there and they're committed to employing their family members. So those are some reasons why a single unit plant may be more likely to survive, and then some reasons why the multi-unit plant may be less likely to survive, just because corporate or headquarters has they're acting optimally for the shareholders, for the entire firm, as opposed to just that branch.
Okay. We have a question about textile plants. So the textile plants you said were one of the types more likely to have disappeared. Could you give examples of types of rural plants that had better odds of surviving?
Okay, yeah. To answer that question, I mean, statistically speaking, all the other industries were just as likely to survive. I don't know if the person asking this question is a stats person or not. So the textile and apparel were the only ones statistically significantly different than the rest. But just looking at summary statistics, not a statistically significant difference. The non-durables that are quintessentially less cyclical were the most likely to survive. So for example, I used food manufacturing as my reference for the industry controls, and that's because food manufacturing was the most likely to survive during the study period.
Okay. Somebody's asking a question because they missed the beginning of the presentation. Can you explain how you tracked the individual plants from 1996 through 2011? He didn't hear the part about the survey was done in 1996, but then what did you do?
Right, yes. Yeah, the survey was conducted by ERS in 1996. I kind of picked it up and recycled it a few years later. And essentially what I did is I used the names and addresses in the survey response and linked to the BLS Quarterly Census of Employment and Wages by the same name and address. And so that QCEW data, that's the State Unemployment Insurance Records, formerly known as ES-202 data, if you're familiar with that. So almost all the states that are participating with BLS at that time participated in the survey. So I was able to basically take the survey and link them to the quarterly unemployment records. And that's what I used to track the plants over time. Okay. Is the message of this that management practices don't seem to matter? Is that accurate? So I didn't talk about management practices. There was a section in this survey on management practices, and I don't cover it in this report. But what we found is just that the particular questions about management practices that were asked in the 1996 survey were not related to survival. So I can't say that necessarily management practices don't matter. I just didn't find a statistically significant relationship with survival in this particular study.
Okay. One last question. With the survey data, are you able to break the rural plants counties down further by RUCC categories in order to see if proximity to a metro area has an impact?
Okay, yes. With the confidential data, I know exactly where the plants are located. So I didn't actually use RUC codes, but I did do some other things looking at proximity. And what I actually found is including a variable that the GIS team here at ERS calculated, which is essentially driving time from the county to the nearest urbanized area. And I actually didn't, other than the metro, non-metro finding, I didn't find a lot of variation within that. So if you look at the journal article, I actually control for non-metro adjacent to metro and non-metro non-adjacent and don't find any differing results. So didn't find a lot of that. There's also some interesting questions in the survey about, I think you mentioned supply chains, Nancy. There's some interesting questions in the survey that ask, are inputs related within an hour's drive, or can you get expertise, technical assistance within an hour drive? And in the journal article that I mentioned, the Growth and Change article, I encourage this question asker to take a look at that. I do include both input and access to markets within a 1-hour drive of the plant based on, because that was a question in the survey. And I do find a weak effect for inputs being related to survival. So if you're closer to your inputs, you're a little more likely to survive. But there's more details on that in the journal article. The ERS report does not cover that particular question.
Okay, we got a couple of last-minute questions. In the paper or report, do you discuss the potential impact that trade adjustments might play, or if trade played in this?
You know, I don't go into a lot about trade. There's a few citations in the report. You know, everything we do here has very technical review and also clearance by upper levels of USDA management. And the upper level clearance suggested that they didn't want us to talk anything about trade just because it was not a focus of this report. You know, with the industry control variables, so controlling for all the different manufacturing industries, I would assume that a lot of the trade effects are absorbed by those industry fixed effects. So there's of course mention of trade because that was a huge shaping factor for manufacturing during the study period, but we don't do any additional work on trade beyond that. There was a question in the survey that asked about the % of sales that went abroad. So essentially a trade proxy question, and I did not find that the % of exports was related to plant survival.
Okay. Do you have any observations about rural versus urban? Anything about aversion to urban or metro locations based in the data?
Aversion to these locations based in the data.
Like maybe where they locate.
Yeah. So don't have sorry, I just don't have a really good answer to that question. I mean, I think that question is coming a little bit from the other end, from the manufacturing location study literature, and there's a huge literature on the location of manufacturers and where they choose to locate. But this study really focused on the other end of things. Given location of a manufacturer, what are the characteristics associated with their survival? So there is a large literature on that question, but there's not much in this particular article on that.
Okay. That's all the questions that we have. Thank you all for joining us, and thank you very much, Sarah. Everyone have a great rest of your day. We appreciate your participation.
Great. Thank you, everyone.